Nowadays, no one agrees on anything, and politics is equivalent to apes flinging feces. After all, why solve a problem when you can dunk on your opponent instead? But it wasn't always this way. In the beginning, there was no need for politics because solutions were obvious. Hungry? Go hunting or foraging. Cold? Build a shelter or wear an animal. Are the gods unhappy? Hold a ritual and sacrifice Bob. Since no one liked Bob anyway, it was a true win-win. How did it all fall apart? Like any good catastrophe, it started because someone was bored. The culprit was a Mesopotamian king. The usual entertainment, like executions, watching slaves fight for food, and sitcom reruns, wasn't cutting it anymore. It wasn't enough for the king's funny bone to be tickled. He needed his brain to be tickled as well. The king attempted fiddling inside an expendable person's head, but literal brain tickling proved lethal. He consulted his wives, but they recommended drinking less and eating more vegetables, which was obviously wrong. Seeking guidance, he did what any rational person would do: cut open a medium-sized animal and read its entrails. After discarding the answers because he didn't like them, he was still stuck without a solution. At the end of his wits, he got a random group of people together and asked them to recommend terrible ideas. Eat sand! Listen to country music! Watch reality TV with your wives! The suggestions were indeed terrible, and everyone had a good laugh. In fact, the king laughed so hard, he found his new source of entertainment: debates. Random shouting was too chaotic, however, so the king set up teams. He named them the left and the right for the sides of the room they stood on. The topics were drawn from a hat, and, most importantly, whatever the teams argued, it had to be completely nonsensical. An important distinction, as this was the time before politics. The first debate was what to do if a building caught on fire. The obvious answer, to put out the fire and rebuild, was against the rules, so teams had to get creative. The left suggested roasting marshmallows. The right suggested starting a cult and worshipping the flames. They debated back and forth on which idea was best. The suggestions were clearly outlandish, and the teams enjoyed flexing their creativity. The king enjoyed it most of all. Roasting marshmallows? Starting a fire cult? How wacky! His brain was undoubtedly tickled. At the end, a ceremony arbitrarily awarded the winners, complete with a tiny trophy and champagne. They were clearly onto something, but could they make it even better? The king created subsections within the teams and placed them on the far left and far right of the room. These people didn't bother pretending to have good ideas and focused on attacking their opponent. Verbally, of course. Then came the ability to switch sides, which was a simple process since left and right were completely arbitrary, based on location. Some even switched mid-sentence and would argue for an idea, then against it, in the same breath. In the center of the room, the king created space for centrists, people who didn't officially belong to either team. Centrists tried to combine the arguments of the left and the right. This was especially funny because the arguments were often, by design, incompatible. Overall, the debates seemed like harmless good fun, but they should have known better. Throughout human history, there has been one universal rule: thinking never ends well. The debates entertained the king for years, but, like earlier in his life, he still found himself wanting more. The modifications were good, but didn't go far enough. He needed a more substantial change. The king took a break from debates, and while watching a completely uninspired duel to the death, he got an idea. Fighting had never particularly interested him, but he could see the appeal. Sure, people liked the athleticism and skill, but they loved the stakes. Every move had real consequences. Even fights without weapons or death still had broken bones, wardrobe malfunctions, and other injuries. If debates were fun without stakes, imagine the laughs if the debaters might die. Fights were violent by nature, but small and contained. Debates, not so much. Commoner lives were inconsequential, but killing whole teams seemed wasteful. The king would have to improvise. No one liked getting spanked, or at least wouldn't publicly admit to it, so he started there. Hardly lethal, but painful and humiliating. For the first time in his life, the king was truly happy. Until he wasn't again. Spanking turned to flogging, then lashing. Losers were tarred and feathered, locked in pillories, and forced to use one-ply toilet paper, without folding it. No matter the escalation, the king found himself wanting more. As you can probably imagine, punishments ruined the fun for everyone else. The once arbitrary distinctions of left and right became battle lines. People no longer switched sides. Friends became enemies, and families broke apart. The only thing that mattered was which side of the room someone stood on. Centrists hoped to avoid consequences by appealing to both sides, but their refusal to commit earned universal hatred. Just when everyone thought it couldn't get worse, a crisis struck. The Wi-Fi went down. The obvious solution was to sacrifice Bob to the gods, but his mom said he was sick and couldn't leave the house. Desperate for a replacement and entertainment, the king turned the question into a debate. Because of their mutual hatred, he assumed the teams would target each other. When they persuasively argued the king himself should be sacrificed, he was surprised. But what else could he do? The king was sacrificed the next day. Both left and right were free of the king and his punishments. It was time to restore order and select the most qualified candidate to be the new king. The left put forward their choice, and the right theirs. It was not the same person. The artificial division had been removed, but the hate remained. Civil war followed. It lasted for years, and many died, so many people, but no side truly won. Victories are temporary, because politics never dies. Ancient Greece had the Agora, Rome, the Senate, the Vikings, the Thing, the French, guillotines. Since humans are terrible at seeing the obvious, we've learned nothing. We'd rather fight than solve problems. It doesn't matter if the topic is seemingly obvious, like is water wet, or is staring at the sun bad. If one side declares a position, the other immediately opposes. What else is there to do? Compromise? You don't compromise with terrorists. The only winners are the guillotine makers, the fire stokers, the media, the obscenely rich. Division drives engagement. Try to change anything, and you're likely to end up in a guillotine yourself. Besides, living in a bubble is cozy. You never have to do any critical thinking, and you get to warp reality to conform to your beliefs. Inconvenient truths are scary. Better to be told what to think and react accordingly.